Good afternoon. My name is Father Thomas Petrie. I am the Dean of the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception over at the Dominican House of Studies across the street. It's a great honor for me to moderate this panel and to be in the presence of such distinguished guests. We have 4 presentations this afternoon on the Thomistic, on the view of marriage, and on various other topics, and the deeper understanding of the doctrinal principles of Humanae Vitae. Our first presentation this afternoon is by J. Budziszewski. He is a professor of government and philosophy at the University of Texas, Austin. He specializes in political, ethical, and legal philosophy. He completed his doctorate at Yale University in 1981. His research interests include classical natural law, virtue ethics, conscience, moral self-deception, and many other things. Among his most recent books are What We Can't Know. Can't Not Know, thank you. It's a double negative. The natural law, for instance, right? And also a commentary on Thomas Aquinas' virtue ethics. He's also authored 3 books for college students, such as How to Stay Christian in College. So if you have college students or children going to college, definitely buy that book for them. His talk this afternoon is a Thomist view on marriage, fruitfulness, and the teaching of Humanae Vitae. Please welcome Dr. J. Budziszewski.
Good afternoon to all of you. I'm really very happy to be here, and I was thinking ahead of time, what sort of thing should I say about being happy to be here and so forth? You know, speakers always give this little jazz, but I realized that although that's all true, I am happy to be here. That's really not what I wanted to say. There's been an awful lot of talk, not only from our panelists this morning, but among us all, and it even began last night, about optimism and hope and pessimism and things of that sort. And these attitudes are very powerful, and sometimes we're hopeful and sometimes we're afraid. I confess that I have moods of optimism and pessimism too, but I suppose I suppose an optimist is somebody who thinks that we can redeem the culture in 60 years, and a pessimist thinks it'll take 600. But I think that we'll have these moods, and they just don't matter. I think we should disregard them. We don't know what will happen. The only thing that matters is hope. God knows what will happen. Nothing can ever separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Neither powers, nor principalities, nor technological paradigms, nor renegade theologians, nor disorders in the church. We are, I think we're soldiers, not generals. Sometimes we imagine that that a good soldier has to know what the general knows, that he has to see the shape of the battlefield. God is the general. We will never see the shape of the battlefield like he does. Not in this life. We don't have to. We don't have to devise Benedict options. Benedict didn't know he was devising a Benedict option. God knew, and that was enough because he was faithful. So I think we don't have to be afraid. What did the Christian knight say when he saw the dragon? Did he estimate whether the dragon could be overcome in his lifetime? I don't think so. He fought the dragon, and he sang while he was doing it for the joy of the fight. So I think that someday when Christians look back on our age, whether it is in 60 years or in 600 years, whenever, I don't think that they'll look back on this as a golden age, far from it. But I think that they will look back on it as a heroic age. Even in our day, even the ordinary exercise of the everyday virtues of temperance and chastity are beginning to recognize the exercise of heroic virtue for many people. And think how much better those future Catholics will understand Catholic sexual ethics than we do, because they will have read the histories of our battles and our failures and our triumphs. You know, the Christian knight was not a pessimist or an optimist, and so I say, let's try by God's grace to be knights. That's all I want to say about that. This is, though, what we face. According to the prevailing view, the love of a man and a woman is not a commitment of the will to the true good of another person, but a feeling or an emotion. And we know, of course, that those things change. You cannot promise to have a feeling or an emotion. Essentially, then, what the culture calls matrimony is cohabitation with formalities. Like cohabiting couples, or cohabiting threesomes, or what have you. A married couple may speak of having a committed relationship, but commitment in the traditional sense is just what they do not have. Sexual intercourse is not viewed as suggestive of the possibility of new life. Neither is having children viewed as requiring intercourse, because these days we have labs for that. Though even in this day of plummeting birth rates, children may still be desired, adults tend to view them as a lifestyle enhancement, something like a home entertainment center, but more expensive. Though having a few children may still be regarded favorably, having more than a few is actually now frowned upon because children consume resources, as we are always reminded. They use up disposable income, and they require a great deal of care. And it is not unusual even to hear somebody thinking, if we abort this child, then there will be more for the child that we're keeping, and we can take him to Disney World. A puzzled writer who is not quite so extreme as to condemn all childbearing says, nevertheless, I quote, "I don't have the answer to the origin of the longing for children that many experience. It's almost certainly due to a complex mixture of biological and social factors. It might even be an evolutionary trick." Against this, we want to argue. We want to say that the love between the husband and the wife is an act of the free will by which the spouses give themselves to each other mutually, totally, indissolubly, and exclusively for the sake of God. Opening themselves to the possibility of bearing fruit is the most beautiful way that they do give themselves to each other and the very basis of their love. By acknowledging that the sexual powers have a procreative purpose, some people would say that we're instrumentalizing ourselves. We're making ourselves merely baby-making machines or begetting machines, or we're making ourselves tools. I think that's false. We are ends in ourselves, but by acknowledging this about us, we are acknowledging what kinds of ends in ourselves we are. We are beings whose biological functions are not shackles, but constitutive properties of our embodied personhood. We do not diminish ourselves by honoring them. We would alienate ourselves by not honoring them. Now, all of this has roots in the doctrine of Thomas Aquinas, about whom I have been asked to speak today. Now, in one sense, matrimony, I should say. Marriage is the act of entering into the matrimonial status. Matrimony is that status, that life itself. In one sense, matrimony seems to be rather complicated, according to Thomas Aquinas, because it has a number of origins, or as he calls them, institutions. He argues that natural law itself originates matrimony in matters that are concerned with having and raising children. Natural law after the fall adds another chapter to that story. It further shapes matrimony so that its natural purposes are not unraveled by the wound of sin, which tempts us to employ our sexual powers in ways that forestall the formation of families or undermine their good order. The civil law, and the Old Testament law also did this in different ways, shapes matrimony with respect to such things as spousal support, inheritance, other benefits of the relationship. And the gospel, the law of the gospel shapes matrimony by directing it to an additional purpose, for the union of the husband and the wife in their procreative partnership represents and makes present the mystery of Christ's union with the church. So we can say then that natural law institutes marriage in one way. Natural law after the fall institutes it in another. The law of the gospel institutes it in still another, and civil law institutes it in still another. St. Thomas says that these various institutions or origins, I quote, are not of the same thing in the same respect. However, they are all linked. Thus, for civil law to treat marriage as something that is contrary to what it is by nature would be profoundly wrong. Any so-called civil marriage would not really be marriage at all. Now, as I said, that's rather complicated. But in another sense, the basics of matrimony are rather simple. St. Thomas says all of this involves only three matrimonial goods. The first good of matrimony, he says, is, I quote, the birth of children and the educating of them to the worship of God. Okay, in other words, he's talking about the procreative good. If I ask my students to identify the purpose of the sexual powers, they usually reply, pleasure. And it's hard to talk them out of that. I've learned, though, that I have to engage their common sense by asking some other questions first. I will focus their attention on our natural teleology by asking them to identify the purpose of the eye, the purpose of the ear, the purpose of the capacity for anger, which arouses us to the ordinate defense of endangered goods, the purpose of our reasoning powers, the purpose of the sexual powers. If I say, finally, what is the purpose of the sexual powers, now they don't say pleasure. It doesn't even occur to them. They say reproduction. That's interesting. That's not bad. That's not bad, but procreation means much more than reproduction. Reproduction merely means turning out new humans by one means or another. If this were the only purpose of the sexual powers, then it wouldn't matter whether the partners were united. In fact, it wouldn't matter whether there were any partners. We could dispense with parents altogether, gestating children in flasks and decanting them when they were ready, and raising them in state-run institutions as they do in Huxley's Brave New World, which, by the way, does not shock my students anymore. Actually, decanting them and raising them in state-run institutions does shock them, but conceiving them that way doesn't. Procreation, by contrast, is the loving act by which posterity is generated. It means conceiving children in the loving embrace of their father and mother. It means not only having them together, but nurturing them together so that they can become virtuous adults. And it means forming families, thereby forging new links between dimmest antiquity and remotest futurity. Any guppy can reproduce. We have the privilege of procreating. The second good of matrimony is the mutual faithfulness of husband and wife, according to Thomas Aquinas. Now, we may be surprised. Why doesn't he say the union between them? He has a lot to say about union, but why does he say their mutual faithfulness? Here he's using the figure of speech, which is called metonymy. It's a figure of speech that he uses a lot. It's the figure in which a part is used to represent a whole, as when I say the crown to represent everything about the institution of monarchy, or when I use the commandment against adultery to represent everything about marriage and sexual purity. St. Thomas doesn't express his thought then by saying that the second matrimonial good is the spouse's union, although that's what he has in mind. Rather, he uses the most important aspect of their union, which is their mutual faithfulness, to represent everything about their union. And he says, I quote, after an injury inflicted upon a man in his own person, none is so grave as that which is inflicted upon a person with whom one is joined. This, he says, is why the Decalogue prohibits adultery immediately after it prohibits murder. If we view procreation and unity as entirely distinct goods of matrimony, then we're making a profound mistake. Today, one hears couples say things like this: we're putting off having children so that we can enjoy each other first. We're putting off having children so that we can be together and grow together first. But according to the inherited wisdom of the United States, of the human race, thanks be to God that the United States is not the whole human race. But according to that inherited wisdom, which is rooted in the natural law, if we seek to enhance matrimonial unity by refusing the gift of children, then we end up merely turning a pair of selfish me's into a single selfish us. The third good of matrimony is sacramental. As the man and woman are espoused, Thomas Aquinas views Christ and the church are espoused. Just because of the indivisible union of the husband and wife, this union can represent and make present the indivisible union of Christ and his church by God's grace. And just as the union of their bodies makes the spouses biologically fruitful, so the sacrament makes their union spiritually fruitful as they pass on their faith to their children and display it to the world. Now, we mentioned just now, this raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? For instance, we mentioned just now that matrimony is indissoluble, but why is it indissoluble? According to St. Thomas, there are two reasons. To understand the first one, consider our difference from the other animals. Among some of the beasts, the female is capable not only of giving birth to the offspring, but also of training them without help from the male. And Thomas Aquinas says that in such species, intercourse is random and indiscriminate. Among other beasts, the female needs assistance. So the male cooperates with the female in caring for them, and this requires that he recognize the offspring, that he possess a natural inclination to care for them, and that a definite male be joined to a definite female. In such species, the male and female cooperate until the children are grown. Now, since we are rational beings, not just beasts, this applies even more to us, because our children need nourishment not just for their bodies, but also for their souls, and the attainment of maturity and virtue takes a long time. But that's only one reason for the indissolubility of marriage. And it's not completely convincing by itself, because it may take a long time, but eventually they're mature. The second reason is stronger. Even after the children have reached maturity and virtue, they still need the help of their parents to establish their own new families. I'm especially conscious of that these days, because I was a father, and it was wonderful. I'm still a father, but now I'm a grandfather. And I find that the children need grandparents, just as they need parents. And the parents need their parents. Hence, it is of the natural law, says St. Thomas, that parents should lay up for their children, and the children should be their parents' heirs. Therefore, since the offspring is the common good of husband and wife, the dictate of the natural law requires the latter to live together forever, inseparably. Now, St. Thomas's doctrine, there are many, look, I'm telling you about one out of every 6 sentences of a much longer paper, and there are a lot of technical things that I'm leaving out and all sorts of interesting side paths and digressions and things that I could go into, but let me cut right to some of the caricatures of Thomas Aquinas' thinking. According to one caricature, St. Thomas is quite interested in the procreative good, but that's about all he's interested in. He's hardly at all interested in the unitive good. Union, procreation, yes. That's utterly false. Now, it's true that he regards the matrimonial friendship as different from other friendships because of its procreative purpose. But for that matter, he thinks every species of friendship has distinct qualities. The friendship of man and God is different than the friendship of two brothers. It's different than the friendship of a teacher with his student. It's different than the friendship of two partners in a common task. On the other hand, although he thinks the matrimonial friendship, the matrimonial union, has certain distinctive properties because it is a procreative partnership, a procreative friendship, everything that applies to loving union in general applies to loving matrimonial union too. And so suddenly we discover that he has a lot more to say about matrimonial union than we thought he did, because he says so much about union in general, and the general aspects of it apply to matrimony also. Taking this into account, St. Thomas actually says more about union than he does about procreation. For example, he says, the lovers experience confidence that what has begun well will get better. They experience glory because each one glories in the good of the other. They are consoled because through delight in the good that they share, each one possesses a remedy against sadness, and they experience exuberant joy because not only is sadness absorbed, but their exuberance overcomes every tribulation. He says that in one of his commentaries on St. Paul's epistles, and he's not speaking just of the matrimonial partnership, but that obviously, in his view, applies to that form of union too. It applies to all of them. It's quite amazing how far Thomas Aquinas is willing to go in describing the quality of loving union. He says, for example, that the lover and the beloved mutually indwell each other. They mutually indwell each other. Now, if I were reading that in ordinary prose that people write today, I would think it's just sort of a vague, sentimental thing that they're saying. But he actually means something. He says, the beloved, I'm quoting, is contained in the lover by being impressed on his heart and becoming the object of his affections. The lover, in turn, is contained in the beloved, inasmuch as the lover penetrates, so to speak, into the beloved. Or take the idea, we make jokes about this, especially when we're thinking of teenagers, that the lover loves to love. We speak of people being in love with loving. Well, in our day, again, we associate language like that with soupy sentimentalism and Hallmark cards and the lavish use of emojis. But St. Thomas gives diamond-hard meaning to it. The power of will, he explains, is directed to the good. Love is a spontaneous act of the will, which is directed to the good of the beloved. But since to will is itself a good, man can will himself to will. For this reason, he says, love by its own nature is capable of reflecting upon itself. Wherefore, says the angelic doctor, from the moment that a man loves, he loves himself to love. This doesn't mean that he's infatuated with his feelings. It means that with all his heart, he concurs with the direction of his will. His attitude toward the beloved might be expressed. I exult that you exist in this world. I seek all good for you, and I know it is good that I do. Another caricature is that St. Thomas frowns on sexual pleasure. On the contrary, he argues that had it not been for the fall, the pleasure of sexual intercourse would have been even greater than it is now. How did we get that turned around? What happened when we fell is not that our pleasure became stronger, but that our reason became weaker. If we had not fallen then, our pleasures would have been even stronger, but they would not have disordered our thinking as they do now. Our minds would obey God, and our passions and desires would obey our minds. Still another caricature is that St. Thomas thinks that the spouses should have intercourse only because they're trying to have children. You know, if you have anything else in mind, when you say, "How about it, honey?" But let's make some babies. You know that you're sinning. This is the idea. Wrong again. He does say that sexual intercourse must always be rightly related to its procreative purpose. And we read into that you must always be trying to have kids at that moment. No, what it means is that the spouses must never do anything to make the procreative act non-procreative, to make their intercourse incapable of bringing about new life. They, as we say today, they have to be open to that. However, they may also have intercourse simply to celebrate their procreative union. Now, it's their procreative union that they're celebrating, but the motive can be celebration. To see this more clearly, we might think of eating. We eat because food is necessary. But as St. Thomas explains, necessity has several different meanings. In one sense, we must eat because otherwise we cannot live or be healthy. But in another sense, we must eat because otherwise, he says, we cannot live becomingly. The beasts know only the first, well, they don't even know it, but only the first meaning of a necessity applies to them. They know nothing of living becomingly. You know, it's just all about, I've got to eat this. But we do. We do understand about this, and this is why we eat and drink more on festive occasions. Why is it that the church has not only fasts but feasts? Not to keep from starving, but to celebrate. Obviously, God endorses this motive. After all, at the wedding feast in Cana, Jesus turned water into wine. Why? To keep them healthy? I don't think so. Now, even at feasts, eating and drinking must still be rightly ordered to life and health. It would be prejudicial to life and health if we ate as much as we could and then purged and went back to the table so that we could eat still more. That would obviously be disordered. Contraception is like that. But right order doesn't require that we eat and drink only for life and health. It is not prejudicial to life and health to toast the married couple with wine. Now, apply these distinctions to the enjoyment of sexual intercourse. In the first sense of necessity, sexual intercourse is necessary simply to be fruitful. But in the second sense, it's necessary so that the husband and wife may enjoy their partnership in the possibility of fruitfulness becomingly, so that they may celebrate it. Even celebratory intercourse, hard word, must still be rightly ordered to procreation, but right order doesn't require that the spouses enjoy intercourse just for making babies. Oh, you weren't thinking about that just now? Then, you better go and confess. Rather, it allows them to enjoy intercourse so long as they do nothing to thwart the procreative possibility of their action, the life-giving possibility of their action. Here's another way to think about the matter. The husband and wife should cherish their procreative union as good in itself, not as a tool for pleasure. But because their union is good in itself, because it is good in itself, it is also pleasurable. For pleasure, says St. Thomas, when I finally understood what he meant by this, it opened doors. It was a breakthrough for me. Pleasure, he says, is the repose of the soul in what is good. Notice here that pleasure is not the main thing. It is the enjoyment of the main thing. Just as knowledge is good, and I take pleasure in knowledge, but I'm not pursuing knowledge for the sake of pleasure. I'm pursuing knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and I experience pleasure in attaining it. Pleasure is not the good itself, it is the delight of experiencing the good. Hedonists get this backward. That includes sexual hedonists, but it's hedonists of every type. Rather than viewing pleasure as repose in whatever is good, they view pleasure itself as the good. In fact, as the only good, and from this point of view, one does not cherish one's wife or husband. For her own sake, he cherishes only the resulting pleasure. It follows from this theory that if there were a way to have the pleasure of one's wife without one's wife, then that would be just as good, or even better. Never mind marriage, let's just arrange to have electrodes implanted to stimulate the pleasure centers of our brains. Why experience pleasure indirectly when we can experience it directly? St. Thomas is pointing out that I should not treat my wife as that electrode. It is for herself that I should cherish her. She is my procreative partner. She is my partner in this distinctive kind of friendship. She herself is what I should cherish, and experiencing the pleasure of that cherishing. What she and I enjoy in both the procreative and unitive aspects of our marital friendship is delightful. It is delightful to rest in the hope of new life. It is delightful to rest in our mutual love as partners in this hope. But if I say, never mind our hope of children, never mind our mutual love, I just want pleasure, then I'm missing the point. I understand neither children, nor love, nor delight. Thank you.